This message comes from NPR sponsor Culturelle, makers of probiotic supplements for kids. This fall, try Culturelle Kids Grow and Thrive, daily packets formulated with probiotics, vitamin D, and HMOs. Use promo code RADIO on Culturelle.com.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White in Washington. 8-year-old Relisha Rudd disappeared from a government-run homeless shelter in Washington, D.C. back in 2014. It took 18 days before anybody realized she was missing, and she's never been found. The city later claimed her disappearance was unpreventable. D.C. journalists will occasionally revisit Relisha's story around the anniversary of her disappearance, but our senior producer, Jonquilyn Hill, decided to go deeper. She's the host and reporter of the podcast Through the Cracks. It investigates the systems that failed Relisha and whether her disappearance really was unpreventable, as the city claims. The podcast's final episode is out tomorrow. JQ, thanks for joining us.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I've really, to say I've enjoyed listening to the podcast doesn't feel like exactly the right thing to say, but it's been incredibly enlightening. What made you want to focus on Relisha's story?
Relisha's story is one that's really stayed with me through the years. And I think, there are so many reasons why. I've lived in D.C. for, I think, almost 12 years now, which is really hard to believe. And I just remember seeing the story on the local news here in D.C. so vividly. I remember working one of my first jobs out of college back when I was a producer on The Hill, and I was taking the train from where I lived over to the Capitol, and in Union Station, I saw her missing poster there, still years later, and it stuck with me that, wow, they still have not found this little girl. How did this happen? How could this have happened?
Well, there's been a lot of reporting on this story since it happened 7 years ago. What did you hope to bring to it that was different?
So I think when it comes to a lot of what are considered true crime stories, there's this element of who done it. And that's not what I set out to do. I knew that, if the police hadn't found out what happened to her, that I would probably struggle to figure out the same. But I wanted to find out how this happened. I wanted to take a deep dive into the different institutions that touched her life, whether it was family or whether it was the public school system or the city-run shelter where she lived. I wanted to, instead of just looking at the crime of what happened, I wanted to look at how this happened and every institution that touched her life.
So just so folks who haven't heard the podcast can understand, just give us a brief understanding of who Relisha was, the people who were around her, her family.
So Relisha Rudd was an 8-year-old girl. She attended second grade here in D.C. And at the time of her disappearance, she was living in a shelter with her family. They'd been evicted over a year ago, and prior to moving to the shelter, they lived in hotels, in hotel rooms provided by the city. She was with her mother, Shamika Young, her stepfather, Antonio Wheeler, and then her 3 little brothers. She was the oldest of 4. She played that big sister role a lot of the time. She also had a grandmother that she was very close with, aunts, cousins, and she also had family friends in her life, including Khalil Tatum, who was a janitor at the shelter and the man she was last seen with.
Now, in the intro, we mentioned that D.C.'s government eventually declared the disappearance unpreventable. Who in local government came to that conclusion and why?
So it was a report put together by the Vincent Gray administration, which was the mayor prior to our current mayor, Muriel Bowser. It was put together with several government agencies, along with a few policy groups. And after they did the report, they put a few recommendations together for how to improve. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really curious to me that the city said it was not preventable, because, there are recommendations they have. There are things that they realized that they could have done better that in theory, could have prevented this tragedy.
You speak to a lot of people for the podcast, but you don't speak to government officials. What has D.C. government's response been to the podcast?
So it's been interesting because a few government agencies have gotten back to us. We talk with the Child and Family Services Agency, or CFSA. That's DC's equivalent of what a lot of people know as CPS, or Child Protective Services. But it was really difficult to get, the subcontractor for the shelter provider, or DC public schools. I think any journalist can tell you that you run up against a lot of no's when you're doing big investigative reporting like this. And a lot of local DC reporters, even folks right in our newsroom here at WAMU can tell you, you don't always get the answers that you want, or answers at all, from DC.
Paint a picture for us of the shelter where Relisha and her family were living when she disappeared. It was a hospital at one time. Just describe the environment they were in.
Right. So DC General Family Shelter was called DC General because it used to be DC General Hospital. Before it closed, at the time, it was the only public hospital in DC. Most of its clientele was poor and Black, and that was a lot of the clientele when it existed as a shelter, too. Shortly after the hospital closed, DC started using the shelter as a hypothermia shelter in the cold winter months. So when it gets below a certain amount of degrees, people in DC are guaranteed a warm place to stay, and that was the service that DC General provided. Over time, though, the population of people experiencing homelessness grew so large that people needed shelter year-round, and that's what DC General became. It certainly has a history of scandal. Prior to Relisha's disappearance from the shelter, under a different provider, there was a scandal at the shelter because people who worked there were using their power and wielding it over people who lived there. So it was reported in the Washington City paper, I believe it was 2010, that some shelter employees would do things like exchange extra blankets or things like juice for kids for sex for residents. So it's a place with a sordid history.
And we should mention here that Khalil Tatum, the last person Relisha was seen with, was an employee at the shelter.
Yes, he worked at the shelter, and he actually was working there despite the fact that he had a felony record. And I think it's important to say that there's something to say about people who have formerly been incarcerated having access to jobs. But at the time, it was against shelter policy for a person with a felony record to work in the shelter. And it turns out that he was able to have employment because the background checks weren't thorough enough. He didn't have a background check from the FBI or from the Metropolitan Police Department, the local police department here.
We're talking about the disappearance of Relisha Rudd and the different ways systems failed her. We'll hear more from you and our guest in a moment.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Integrative Therapeutics. For over 35 years, their focus has been on manufacturing high-quality supplements such as Cortisol Manager and Adrenal Complex, produced with premium ingredients, designed by clinicians, and based on established ingredient research. Committed to helping people feel confident as they navigate their health journey. Integrative Therapeutics, because confidence is healthy.
On NPR's Consider This podcast, we don't just help you keep up with the news, we help you make sense of what's happening. Like what the case about George Floyd's killing means for the ongoing fight for racial justice, or how to best navigate a pandemic that's changed life for all of us. All of that in 15 minutes every weekday. Listen now to Consider This from NPR.
We're talking about the disappearance of Relisha Rudd. Now, the 8th and final episode of the podcast is coming out, and as we said, Relisha has never been found. So how do you end a podcast when there are so many lingering questions?
I think you have to tackle it head on and acknowledge the lingering questions, and that's something we definitely do in the final episode. Relisha still has not been found, but we take a look also at what the city has changed and how policy, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to children experiencing homelessness, how that has changed since Relisha disappeared. I think it's safe to say there's kind of a policy pre-Relisha and a policy post-Relisha, and it's really heartbreaking that a little girl had to disappear for changes to happen, but those changes have taken place.
And just give us an idea of some of the changes that have happened in the years since.
So I think the biggest, most visible change is the fact that DC General is now closed. It's been locked since October 31st, 2018, and they have now instated smaller family shelters in every ward of DC. And so that's kind of how DC is split up. It's split up into different wards, and so now there is a shelter for families in every single one. Also now it's policy for different government agencies to communicate with one another more and in better ways. There were lots of city and social services that touched the life of Relisha and her family. The Department of Behavioral Health, DC Public Schools. You get a caseworker when you're in shelter to help you try to find housing. So there were lots of caseworkers who weren't necessarily communicating with one another or aware of what was going on in another part of the family's lives. So now there's a concerted effort for that communication to happen so that these gaps don't exist for people to fall through.
So we talked about Relisha living with her family in a D.C. homeless shelter that was run by the government. And as you said, she also went to a nearby elementary school, and her family was big. And so she moved pretty frequently among various relatives' homes. So at first, they didn't even know she was missing. Here's a clip of Relisha's stepfather, Antonio Wheeler, talking about how he first learned Relisha was missing. And he describes how his wife, Shamika, Relisha's mother, wasn't cooperating with the investigation.
Detectives told me to ask Shamika what's going on. Shamika, what's going on? She just sitting there with her hand on. Shamika, what's going on? So Shamika never tells him. So the detective said, Mr. Wheeler, you know where your daughter is? Yeah, she at Ashley's house. They said, are you sure? I'm like, y'all stop playing with me. She's at Ashley's house, So they're like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah. Why, what's up? I'm like, well, we got word that she's missing. Whoa, wait a minute. Shamika, what they talking about? I don't know what they talking about. They lying. These whole FBI agents and detectives. So I asked them, I said, can y'all please send somebody over to Ashley's house?
So we should mention here that Ashley is Relisha's aunt and Relisha's mother is Shamika. So 18 days passed before someone realized Relisha was missing, including her family. How did that happen?
I think that's the biggest question that comes from the podcast. It's hard because on one hand, it's this big extended family. Kids are staying at different places. People think one kid is with one person and they're actually with another person. Antonio actually was working outside of the city quite a bit. He was taking construction jobs in Pennsylvania, so he wasn't always looped in. So it's feels at times unbelievable. But then when you talk to the family about the chaos of living in the shelter, it begins to make more sense. A lot of families will have their kids stay with family members or friends because the kids didn't like staying at DC General. It was this place where, there were hospital beds and, you had to go through metal detectors and there were, community showers. So they tried to have the kids at the shelter as little as possible. And she got lost through that shuffle.
Well, the police investigation went cold, as we said, and it remains unsolved. But you spoke to her family, not her mother. Her mother has refused multiple interview requests. But here's a clip from a conversation you had with Relisha's grandmother.
I didn't know what was going on. The police officer, your granddaughter, Alicia Rudd, is missing. No, she not. Yes, she is, ma'am. No, she's not. She's with Khalil Tatum.
What does Relicia's family think happened? Are they on the same page about it?
I think overall they still have hope that she'll come home. Melissa, her grandmother, does this thing every Christmas where she'll buy Relicia Christmas gifts because she doesn't want her to come home and not have anything under the tree. At the same time, when you talk with them, they go back and forth intense a lot. Sometimes it's is, sometimes it's was. I think sometimes there is a thought that she may not come home and she may not ever be able to. But all in all, the family tries to remain positive about finding her and that she's still out there.
What about the police? What do they think happened?
So I actually went to an anniversary event for Relicia's disappearance this year. And police there said that they are still looking for her, that they're still looking for her alive. I have heard through various sources, though, that the case has been moved to homicide. So I think police are looking at both options. But as more and more time passes, I think people are becoming less optimistic about finding her alive.
And what are the barriers at this point to doing further police investigations into this case?
I mean, with the 18 days, they lost so much time. I think that's what makes Relicia's case so interesting, is that it's so atypical. Typically, when a kid goes missing, they're found really quickly. Over 99% of missing persons cases in DC get solved, and people are found and they go home. That's not the case here. And part of the reason was that because so much time was lost. I spoke with a reporter for the podcast, and she says, missing kids cases, local news does them all the time. You can turn on a news station anywhere and find something about a missing child, but typically they're found. But the stories just kept happening. She still wasn't found. And so I think the major barrier to finding her is the time that was lost.
Coming up, we'll learn more about Khalil Tatum, the man Relicia was last seen with.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Wyzant, a one-to-one tutoring alternative to online classes where you can learn face-to-face online. Get help with tackling new subjects and career skills, or just catching up. Wyzant lists thousands of personal instructors in over 300 subjects, available for live, individualized lessons with their online learning platform. Head to wyzant.com to find your perfect instructor. Love it, or your first hour is free. Because at Wyzant, we take learning personally.
Hearing loss is a fact of life for many humans, but not for fish, reptiles, or birds.
People noticed in chickens that they could take them to, say, heavy metal concert, blast the ears really to oblivion, and then within days, new hair cells would begin to sprout.
The Science of Sound. That's next time on the TED Radio Hour from NPR.
Now let's get back to our conversation about Through the Cracks. That's a podcast looking at the disappearance of Relicia Rudd and the different ways systems failed her. We got this email from George JQ, who says, it sounds like Relicia's mother didn't care about her. This isn't DC's fault. It's her family's. Put the blame where it belongs. And as we said, you weren't able to talk to Shamika, her mother, but there was a lot of this sentiment in the press and in the public when Relicia disappeared, and that's continued over the years. What did you find in your reporting around this family's story and around Shamika's story herself?
Yeah, I think George's email is really interesting because that's a critique that I've gotten as the podcast has, come out, and also as everything was happening. Where was her mom, the family, like, this is them. And I think it's interesting because what I'm not trying to do is, take responsibility away from them. Were there things that they could have done differently? Yes. But I think more so what I'm trying to do is look at their actions in a bigger context. Her grandmother, Melissa, grew up in what she describes as an abusive home and experienced sexual assault as a child. And then Shamika and her siblings were put into foster care after being evicted and experiencing homelessness. And I've talked with a lot of experts that just talk about the toll that can take. It can have an impact on development and decision making. And then Shamika was dealing with her own mental health things in addition to that trauma. And then Shamika and Antonio were evicted, and we quote Matthew Desmond, who is the author of Evicted and who works at Princeton's eviction lab, and talks about the psychological impacts of eviction. It's stressful, it's painful, it can lead to depression. You end up making, and you're experiencing homelessness, you end up making decisions that you wouldn't if you weren't under duress. And so, yes, there were mistakes made, but there are reasons those mistakes made. And on top of that, in our society, we have built in safety nets for when those mistakes are made. And those also failed. So I think it's looking at this in a bigger context and saying, okay, what support are we providing for families who are experiencing trauma, who are experiencing any number of these things, and where are those safety nets lacking? Because if we're honest with ourselves, the pandemic's going to end soon, and there are eviction moratoriums across this country. Those are going to end. What happens if those families experience homelessness? Have we created the resources for those families to be supported? And I think that's something we have to ask ourselves.
We got this question from Alan on Twitter, who says, who reported the child missing? Also, what was the 8-year-old's teacher told about her absences? Do we know? And JQ, this is something you get into, the fact that there was a social worker at the school Relisha attended who was supposed to be checking in with her to make sure she was okay because of her situation. But what do we know about that school piece of this?
So the school piece is really interesting because it was a school social worker who realized something was off. He just realized it a little too late. So Relisha wasn't in school, but she was being excused from notes from a doctor. And this doctor was a Dr. Tatum. So someone, either Tatum or someone else, was writing notes on behalf of Relisha and claiming to be a doctor. So there was one day when the heat was out in the school, and this social worker took a call with the doctor in the principal's office, and the principal was like, just head down to the shelter and see what's going on. Because this was the elementary school that served the shelter. There were a lot of kids. There were over 600. When it was at its peak, there were over 600 children living at DC General. So he went down to the shelter and asked for a Dr. Tatum, and people were like, no. And finally someone said, there's not a Dr. Tatum here, but there's a Tatum that's a janitor. And that was the moment that the city was notified. He called the child abuse hotline, and that's what got the ball rolling.
Well, Khalil Tatum was a janitor from the shelter. He befriended the family, and on the day the search started for Relisha Rudd, Khalil Tatum shot and killed his wife, Andrea Tatum. She was found by police in a motel room. He later fatally shot himself. And here's an excerpt from Through the Cracks discussing Relisha's relationship with Tatum, but also Tatum's relationship with other residents at DC General. And in the beginning, you're going to hear a former resident of DC General talk about how well-liked Khalil Tatum was by most of the residents.
Everybody knows him. He bought my daughter a fish tank, but I stopped it there. No more gifts.
DC General had a policy against fraternization, meaning employees were supposed to be extremely professional with shelter residents and not develop personal relationships with them. Relisha's family's relationship with Tatum didn't develop overnight. In DC General, parents were supposed to be with their children at all times, in the cafeteria, going to the showers, in the play areas, But Relisha's grandmother, Melissa, remembers Khalil Tatum making sure Relisha and her brothers got a meal, even if their mom wasn't with them in the cafeteria.
Like I said, Relisha would do the mother, big daughter thing and take them down for breakfast. That's how Relisha came in contact with Tatum. Because he would always say, well, you know, her mother is in the bathroom, that's why they down here. She asked me to make sure they get their breakfast, something like that, so my daughter wouldn't get in trouble.
At some point, Khalil Tatum transitioned into a different job at the shelter. He became a janitor, and he grew even closer to Shamika and her kids. This is Antonio, Relisha's stepdad.
By this time, Shamika was like, did you know he was her godfather? No, he's not her godfather. And I told him to his face, you're not her godfather, stay away from my daughter. So Shamika, keep Relisha away from this man. Did she listen? No.
Shamika hasn't agreed to an interview with us, but multiple people we've spoken with confirmed that she trusted Tatum. Melissa told us that Relisha would play with Khalil Tatum's granddaughter. Occasionally, she'd even sleep over. Ashley, Relisha's aunt and Shamika's sister, thought the arrangement was a little weird, just like Antonio did. As the months at DC General went by, Relisha spent more and more time at her auntie Ashley's because she hated living at the shelter. So the first time Ashley actually met Khalil Tatum, it was when he came to her house to pick Relisha up.
I never knew him before then. That was the first time I got to meet him. And the questions that I had for him was, well, where do you know my family from? Basically, how did you get my number? How did you get my address? Me, honestly, I'm just auntie. No, I didn't really know who he was. Did I fully trust him? I'm going to be honest, no, because I didn't know him like that. But at the same time, hearing the things that he was doing with my niece, they was going to little parks with the kids or things like that, I didn't have any problem. At the same time, I do wish I would have stood my ground and say, no, she couldn't go. But again, you can't overstep what the parents are saying.
Now, JQ, Khalil Tatum, as I understand it, had a granddaughter, and part of the relationship with Relisha was formed around this idea that it's basically a play date, that Relisha and the granddaughter are coming together to play. But what else did you learn about him?
It was interesting. I actually learned quite a bit. Listening to that clip back is really interesting because you can kind of just hear how he would endear himself not only to Relisha's family, but other families in the shelter. You know, here's this man who's going to help you and look out for you in this place that's, cold and dirty while you're dealing with, trying to find housing and get out of shelter. Going into the podcast, one thing that stuck out to me was the murder of his wife, Andrea Tatum. Because this is a story with more than one victim. Mm-hmm. And, there's been a few pieces here and there, but there was not a lot of in-depth looks at her and her life and what their life was like. One of the interviews I'm most proud of this season is a conversation with her daughter, Alexis, who really shed light on what her mother was like, but also shed light on what Tatum was like. One thing she said that really stuck out to me was that, he was the nicest guy. He was charming. He could dress. He was funny. He would give you the shirt off his back. He just seemed like a kind person. And that a person who would do something like this was not the Tatum she knew. And also how that impacted her. Like, she says, it's had an impact on her relationships and trusting, and just the fact that if someone can love you as much as she saw him love her mother and then murder her, well, then what does that say about relationships and love? And so I took a lot away from that particular interview regarding him, but also just the way that people can endear you to them, or, what happens when that kind of trust is broken and how earth-shattering that can be.
I want to play this last clip from a former police officer who was part of the team investigating Relisha's disappearance. This is Jonathan Rosnick.
Detectives got on scene and you realize, wait a minute, how long? She's been gone like 2 weeks at this point, right? She's been gone a long time. Why are we just finding out about this now? And you begin interviewing other people, and you start to find out about this sort of shadowy relationship with Khalil Tatum and his involvement with all of this. And like, there's this pattern of taking Relisha and bringing her back, and taking Relisha and bringing her back. And like, now what prompted this as a call? It was very clear very quickly that this was not a typical, if there is such a thing, a typical missing person case. That we're dealing with something much bigger, much more nefarious here.
So you have the police investigation into Relisha's disappearance, and then this flurry of media activity around it as well. I'm curious how this has made you think about missing persons cases more broadly, and how they're investigated, how they're initiated, and how they're covered in the media.
It's really interesting. I spoke with some of the folks at Black and Missing, which is an organization that sheds a spotlight on missing people of color and just the differences in media coverage and police attention. And also, one thing that is really interesting to me is the fact that how we treat kids who are considered quote unquote runaways. In order to get an Amber Alert issued, there needs to be a belief that the child was abducted. That's part of the criteria. So a lot of children who go missing, who maybe run away or something else, don't get that same attention. But it's still a child not being where they're supposed to be. And on top of that, do we ever ask the question, well, what is this child running away to or running away from? So it really shed a lot of light on that. And it also showed me the ways that journalists often are just as much investigating these cases as police officers, especially in the beginning. A lot of the times people have the same clues. And it's interesting because Jonathan said, there was this local journalist that he felt like he was working the case with. Like, he would get a tip and she would already be there, or he would come somewhere and she would be pulling up just the same. And so it really opened my eyes, whose stories are getting told, how long they're getting told for, and what makes news.
That's Jacqueline Hill. She's the host and reporter for the podcast Through the Cracks. It looks at Relisha Rudd's disappearance and the systems around her that failed to keep her safe. Jacqueline is also a senior producer for 1A, and you can find Through the Cracks wherever you get your podcasts. JQ, thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today's producer was Katie Klein. Our podcast is produced by Barb Anguiano. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening, and let's talk again tomorrow. This is 1A.
Support for this NPR podcast and the following message come from Betterment, a full-service 401k provider. Help attract and retain talent by helping your employees save for retirement and more. No business is too small to get started. Learn more at betterment.com/401k.